Well, in UK, the preservation of cultural heritage, particularly in the form of preservation of old buildings, is something that is taken very seriously. And in the process of this preservation, a meticulous effort is seen on the part of the government. But what I find very interesting is equal active participation of the community in an attempt to preserve their cultural heritage. One of the biggest challenges, I believe, is securing funding for such restoration projects. Another challenge which I personally feel in a country with such a rich historic heritage um, is to maintain the delicate balance between preserving his heritage and meeting the modern demand. I think historic buildings are actually symbols that express the cultural history, the heritage, the traditions of a region, and play a pivotal role in the identity of any region. An interesting example in the UK for that will be the Royal Mile of the Edinburgh, where the centuries old buildings architectural narrate the stories of the historical times, the medieval history. The preserved structures that not only draw tourists but also give the locals a profound sense of pride. And the way it is preserved is a beautiful combination of rich culture weaving into the modern present. Of my many experiences, I would like to share my experience of visit to the Warwick Castle. Walking through the halls, the towers and the gardens of this magnificent castle, I could feel a connection to the past, and I believe it is the meticulous effort that has been put into restoration of this historic castle, that preservation of the grandeur of the castle, that gives one the profound experience of an immediate connection to its rich cultural heritage. So I believe it's not just preservation of a building, not just a preservation of a structure, it's actually the preservation of the stories, the traditions, the culture.
Okay, so Yusuf, as we know, you have lived your entire life in Kuwait. Could you share a personal story or a connection you might have with a historic building?
Um, One of the historic buildings I visit in Kuwait, it's called Ambarkiya Souk.
Mm.
Okay, in Kuwait City, this traditional market has been chemical and a culture hub for countries. It seemed like it's like old old place, like it's selling fruits or whatever, like it's old days.
Mm.
But it's have the traditional design elements.
Mm.
That's what I can remember. Like,
As
yeah,
we know, that buildings take a huge part in identifying a city or a country. For example, in Dubai, there is Burj Khalifa, that is a very big tower.
yeah.
So, do you think that these buildings are essential for cities to be recognized and be known?
Yeah, sure. Kuwait have too many buildings like Raja Kuwait, the Kuwait Towers.
Yes.
Okay. It really helped to preserve the collective memory and historical legacy of a society. It allows future generation to connect with their roots. understand their heritage, and appreciate the culture, significance, and their surroundings.
Mm, very right. Okay, Yusuf, how does your country and your government take care of its historical sites and its historical buildings?
Okay, so Kuwait, like many countries, recognize the importance of preserving the old buildings
Mm.
and cultural heritage. Uh, the Kuwait has laws to regulations in place to protect historic buildings. The Kuwaiti government, along with private organization and individuals, invest the restoration and maintains the historic buildings. Efforts are made to ensure that these buildings retain their original feature and cultural significance.
Mm. So, Yusuf, what are some challenges you have seen the government faces and the society faces?
The challenges faced in preserving old buildings
Mm.
in Kuwait is rapid urban development. The demand for new infrastructure and urban spaces often leads to demolish or neglect the historic structure, but it remains an ongoing challenge.
Thank you so much, Yusuf, for your time.
You're
Okay.
welcome. Yeah, no problem.
Hi, Chingiz. The way in Denmark they do it is that they don't use or put the old buildings as just buildings to be preserved. They keep them functional. So normal people are living in those buildings, and here I'm not talking about castles or those kind of buildings, but the cities, the center of the cities, the buildings in the center are from 16th century or 17th century, but they have kept them the way they were, but they are being used very functionally today for normal purposes. For example, shops or people are living there, and I think that's also very successful because then they don't need to invest separately to maintain those buildings, but the people who are using those buildings are maintaining them as well while they are very historical buildings. I think it's kind of the same as I alluded earlier. So the identity of the cities, they have fundamentally not demolished the old buildings and built the new city with new modern buildings. If you go to any Danish city, even the big cities like Copenhagen, the center of the city is still based on old buildings. So Gothic style buildings from 15th century and 16th century. So every city still has this very historical feel, and that's more or less the same in all the northern Europe. And perhaps an interesting example is simply there's a city called Odense, and if you know this fairy tale author Hans Christian Andersen, he is very famous with his fairy tales for children. This perhaps the most interesting one or the most famous one is this ugly duckling. So his house in this city of Odense is a museum, but everything around his house are still the buildings from the same time, but there are normal people living there. So they maintain that, they use them every day, and they have certain limitations, of course. They cannot change the outlook of the building, and if they have to modify anything, they have to take permission from the government. But that means that all the ancient buildings are very well cared for. A personal experience, my apartment in Aalborg in Denmark, it's also around 200-year-old building where I have my apartment, and it's in the center of Aalborg, the city I live in. So it's a very ancient building in some way. So I live there, and again, we are not allowed to change the outlook of the building. We cannot change its facade or all that, so that it kind of mixes with the whole feel of the city center, which is based on historic buildings. But we do have to maintain that. And we have some street art on the side of the building where it's done by the commune. It's very expensive, the artist who does that, but then the city kind of supports us in paying that artist so it looks very pretty. And when tourists come, they come and take picture of that building and that art. So it's it's very nice feeling. If you're walking in these small cities in Europe and Journal, you feel like you're walking in a museum because all the buildings are quite historic, quite well maintained, and they are not just buildings there to be looked at. They are functional buildings. They are being used for all different kind of purposes.